Alrighty, we will get stuck into composting first. So you might be here for a variety of reasons, whether you're trying to save money or you're trying to improve your garden or you're trying to prevent greenhouse gas emissions and take climate action. They're all things that composting and worm farming contribute towards. So composting is a natural process by which food and garden waste decomposes into a nutrient-rich material called compost, or kind of like a humus-like material. Has many applications, so it can be used as a seed raising mix, mulch, and soil conditioner. And by composting, you can improve your soil quality and the biodiversity in it, as well as your garden vitality. You can save water and money. You'll recycle valuable nutrients that would have otherwise been lost if it was disposed of in your curbside. And you can prevent greenhouse gas emissions and landfill impacts. So when food and garden waste goes into landfill, which majority does not through our FOGO bin, but when it does, the way that things break down in landfill is through anaerobic organisms. And basically, these are bacteria and microbes that thrive in oxygen depleted environments, like in landfill, and they generally produce methane and other greenhouse gases in quite large amounts. So that's one of the reasons how it can help to prevent greenhouse gas emissions and the landfill impacts associated with that, which are also leachates as well, which can be environmentally damaging. So the common types of composting we have um, are hot and cold, which you can see on the left here. They're both a very similar method, but just vary in how much you aerate them. We'll get into that in a second. There's tumbler composting, which is when you have a raised bin above the ground, which can then be turned, and also pet poo composting, because pet poo can't actually usually go into normal compost streams if they're going to be used on edible gardens like fruit and veg and herbs as well. So hot composting is a traditional method. So one of the most popular and long-standing sort of methods, and also one of the easiest to implement, where compost is stacked in a single pile which is turned regularly. The pile produces heat, which aids the decomposition process. So the pros of this is it doesn't require any specialist equipment. It's very simple to get started. It is literally just a pile. Um, so very cost effective. Uh, it also handles much higher volumes of waste, so ideal for those with large properties. Um, the heat generated from this process also makes it faster than others. Um, and management as well in terms of weeds, pests, and diseases is much better than other methods because effectively the heat breaks them down. However, the cons of it are that the maintenance can be a bit much. It does need to be aerated regularly and turned, hence how it breaks down so quickly. Um, and also the volume of it. So this can be the volume of waste required. So this can be a pro or a con, depending on if you're on a larger property or a smaller one. For example, if you're in an apartment building, this would be nearly impossible unless you have some very friendly and willing neighbors. On the other hand, cold composting is pretty much the same process. So again, it's piled up. You can, for both of these as well, sometimes people will use bay systems. So you have maybe usually about three bays, which will be as the material breaks down, it gets moved between the bays. But a pile just anywhere works just as well. So cold composting is they're primarily the material is primarily decomposed through beneficial organisms rather than heat. So these organisms would include different microbes and bacteria and fungi. Um, so that biodiversity in it is a really one of the most beneficial parts of cold composting. Other pros are that it requires little to no turning and it's very simple to start, much like with hot composting. Um, the quality as well. So cold composting encourages biodiversity in the form of organisms and microorganisms. These are really beneficial in terms of improving the vitality and health of your soil and the product in general as well of your compost. The more biodiversity you have in your soil, the more resistant it's going to be to threats. And overall, it'll give a better boost to your garden as well. It's also very cost effective again. So you can use sleepers, chicken wire, or a store-bought bin to contain the materials, but they're just a couple of examples. You can really get creative with this and use whatever you have on hand because yeah, it's a very simple system to get started with. Um, Cons though are that it requires more space than hot compost. This is effectively because the waste isn't breaking down as quickly. So the trade-off is when you have more biodiversity and a healthier compost, it does take much longer to decompose, and hence speed is another con. However, if you do have a lot of space and time, I would more so recommend cold composting over hot so that you are retaining a lot of those beneficial organisms. However, if you're trying to suppress weeds and diseases, then I would probably opt for hot composting instead. So really it just depends on what your sort of considerations and goals are through composting. Tumbler composting. So this is quite a common one as well, and especially for people with smaller gardens or in balconies, sorry, units and places with balconies and whatnot. Um, they're a lot more compact and they're also great for people with mobility issues. But basically, these tumbler composting systems use a rotating drum or a tumbler to aerate and mix composting materials. And this ensures even decomposition and accelerates the process as well. Um, so pros of this, the management, it's very easy to turn and hence it's great for those with mobility issues. Yeah, it uses a sort of lever on the side of it. You can't quite see in this picture, but you spin it with the lever on the side. And it's yeah, very easy to do so unless you've put too much into it. Um, they're also very pest resistant. So because of the enclosed design, it helps to prevent these pests and also contain odors. However, cons of it are the capacity. Um, they're definitely not suitable for larger volumes of waste like hot and cold composting systems are, or the piling methods. And it can also be a lot more expensive than more simple compost piles or bins. And the next system we'll explore is pet poo composting. Um, these are an interesting one because they take many different forms. The main thing is that they can pet poo can be composted through traditional means, definitely, and through any of the ones that I've just mentioned, but it cannot be used on any edible plants. So like it can't go anywhere near your soil where you're growing fruit, veg, herbs, anything that you might eat because of the pathogens in it, in the pet waste, that is. So basically what these pet poo composting systems do is decompose the pet waste into usable compost. And most commonly, these take the form of what are called worm towers. And as so in this picture here that you can see on the left, this is a tumbleweed worm farm. Um, and above on the top, the sort of gray part of it, the big gray part, is a chamber. And then underneath it, it's buried about 30 centimeters into the ground. And this has holes all around it, the material. So worms can actually move in and out of that as you load it up with pet waste as well as any other food scraps as well. And as the materials pass through the digestive tract of the worms, it helps to eliminate those pathogens, and without harming the worms as well. But still not enough to fully guarantee that those pathogens won't still be there afterwards. Hence why we recommend not to put them near any edible plants. Other pros of this are the management. It's low maintenance and usually very easy to install. The towers are dug directly into the soil, which is then cultivated and fertilized as worms pass through. The versatility of it. So, as I mentioned, it can also take kitchen scraps and other household organics. So, basically, anything else that you would put into your compost bin for the most part. You do just have to be mindful, depending on how much you're aerating it, that it may not break down as quickly as what other composting methods would. And it will also be a lot smellier. So, you might not want to be opening it up too often. It's also very eco-friendly. So you're diverting all of that pet waste from landfill and recycling those nutrients back into the soil. Especially over the lifetime of a single pet, that amounts to a lot of pet waste that you're getting those nutrients back from. However, cons are the cost. So this tumbleweed one, for example, costs about $230, so they can be very expensive. There are definitely more cost-effective options out there in terms of store-bought options, but I would highly recommend making your own sort of version of this, which I'll get into in a second. Um, the practicality as well, they're not really suitable for properties without a garden. You do need soil and a place to put this in a garden bed. So if you live in a smaller property, you're probably not going to have anywhere that you can actually put one of these. So that's something to consider. And again, it's application, so it definitely cannot be installed near edible plants. So if the large majority of your garden consists of edible plants, this might not be right for you, or if you simply just don't have a feasible area for it other than near your edible plants. Um, Also a bit of a, oh, excuse me, couple of tips as well. So if you're putting cat litter into this, then just make sure that the material it's made of is compostable. So these materials include recycled newspaper, plant pulp, wheat wood, or grass. And definitely worth noting that clay and crystal litters are non-compostable. A lot of them they contain different plastics or other kind of synthetic compounds as well that are no good to be putting in the soil. Um, Also, make sure you install the system in soil with good drainage so that the excess moisture can go into the ground. Um, and definitely somewhere that isn't below the water table because it will it will be a bit of a mess if that happens. If the water table rises and the pet waste is part of that. Um, and also after deworming your pet, wait at least a week before adding to the system again. kind of goes without saying, but this just ensures the health of the worms in the ground. Also, on that note, worms that can be used are so red regulars, tiger worms, they're store-bought ones. So they come in big packs of usually about 500 to 1,000. But also you can, if you have a garden, if you have soil that is rich with earthworms, then you can rely on them for this. But I wouldn't I wouldn't primarily rely on that myself, just because that method can be a bit more temperamental, given that earthworms aren't quite as hungry as what red wrigglers and tiger worms are, which they're they're usually the worms that you put in a worm farm. So as I was saying just before, you can make your own worm towers. These can be used either as just a kind of in the ground worm farm, so they don't have to have pet waste in them. But they are a great alternative if you're trying to save a bit of money and don't want to buy one of the store-bought systems, or you want multiple of them because they're very customizable as well. The one on the right here is made from terracotta clay. Um, so it just goes to show you can really make them out of a lot of different materials. The two on the left are made simply from just some PVC pipe. And basically, it's each of these, again, would have about 30 centimeters dug into the ground with perforations in it, so that the worms can move freely in and out. And basically, you would just layer these as you would with a worm farm, which we'll get into later. So you'd layer your materials and then just make sure it's covered as well at the top to stop pests and excess moisture and whatnot getting in there. So some other systems are Bokashi and electric composters, so Bokashi bins, I should say. I haven't actually said composting systems here because technically I wouldn't so much call them composting systems. So, for example, with Bokashi bins, they're a method that uses anaerobic fermentation to break down organic materials. So, similar to landfill as well, uses the same sorts of organisms in there. Um, and basically, Bokashi bins you can fill with anything and everything in terms of organic matter, but it is fermented instead of broken down naturally through aerobic organisms, which would be through composting. Um, Basically, this makes it a compost ready product instead. So that's one of the big pros of it, the versatility. If you are wanting to compost or dispose of meat, seafood, bones, and dairy without putting it into your curbside bins, then this is definitely a good option. Um, but just know that it isn't a ready product, really. It still needs to break down further for the nutrients to be made available. So also, other limitations of it are that it can only handle small volumes of waste. So you can see here they're relatively small buckets. I'd say they'd be about 50 centimeters in height, about 50 to 60 centimeters in height, and then about 30 centimeters across. Um, it's also not garden ready, so it has to be composted again via an aerobic method. So any of the composting systems I've shown you before. And also the cost of it. So there are ongoing costs associated with it, especially the Bokashi mix. Basically, this mix is a sort of sawdust that's been inoculated with with the organisms that will break down those materials or ferment them. But again, if you are wanting to compost meat, dairy, seafood, and bones, anything of that sort, this will make the product ready to go into your compost. Um, and also, it can just be dug straight into the ground and it will break down over time from there. Um, Secondly, an electric composter. So this is a device that accelerates the decomposition process. It isn't too true to the name in truth. It basically dehydrates the materials, so it reduces the volume of them very quickly, which is part of what composting does, but it's not a ready product at the end of it. It does need to be composted again. So pros in here, it can produce compost very quickly. Sorry, that is a typo. It is not compost, but it's a product that can go into your compost. It's also compact, odorless, and easy to operate. Cons, however, are that it can only handle small volumes of waste. They're also very expensive and adds electricity, and electricity adds to its operating cost and carbon footprint. And the product as well must be added to a composting system. So these can be really good if you're in a smaller property, both of these systems actually, but they aren't exactly traditional aerobic composting systems where you'll have a product that can go directly onto your garden at the end of it. So, as a sort of couple of kind of a golden rule, I guess, and these four steps are a really great guide to getting a really good compost, like a great compost product at the end of the process. So, number one, choosing the right site. The second, getting your ingredients and making sure you're getting the right ingredients and the right mix of them. Third, layering your materials. So, really important part of it is making sure that you're alternating your materials when you're layering them up. And then maintaining your compost. So, one of the big things that often happens with composting and worm farming is people lose interest and then they tend to just sit there. So, you won't get a very good compost if that's the case. So it's definitely important to make sure that you are maintaining it, which we'll get into. So firstly, choosing the right site. To ensure optimal conditions for decomposition, your compost should be in an area that is level, well drained, semi-shaded, easily accessible, and close to a water source. So the easily accessible part of it is very important again. Make sure it's somewhere that you actually are going to want to walk to, or make sure it's you can easily get there, especially on really hot days or really cold days or when it's raining. You might not want to have to walk all the way to the back of your yard to be able to put your waste into there. So definitely consider that with the placement. And also, because you'll have to add water to it, that's why it should be close to a water source. So ideally a tap or a bucket or something where you can easily add water to it when needed. After that, you'll want to gather your ingredients. So on the left here, these are all materials that are great for compost. And pretty much in your compost, you want about a ratio of 60 to 70% carbon or brown materials. And these are tree clippings, chopped, and part of that chopped sticks and twigs, dry leaves and bark, paper, newspaper, and cardboard. Um, Ideally, this would be shredded or torn. Straw and mulch, potting mix can go in there, any old potting mix you have, sawdust from untreated timber, hair, wool, and cotton. Other people might recommend vacuum dust as well. I typically don't because often when you're vacuuming, especially carpeted floors, a lot of them are made from synthetic materials. And if you have any synthetic fibers in your house, like polyester for your clothing, or lycra, anything of the sort, those fibers will break down and then they get pulled up by the vacuum. So I wouldn't recommend putting that in your compost if that's the case. But if you only have natural fibers around your home, like wool and cotton, then go ahead. Like can definitely go straight into your compost. Um, the other 30 to 40% of the materials are what we call nitrogen or green materials. So these are fruit and vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, eggshells, loose leaf tea, grass and garden clippings, and seed-free weeds. So with the weeds especially, you want to make sure they haven't gone to head. And because if you do put them into your compost, the seeds will survive unless you are hot composting. And if they go into your cold compost, then they will just spread around your garden once you put that onto your garden. Um, Also with tea bags as well. So this is another one that commonly does get put onto the list of accepted ingredients in compost, but unfortunately this is wrong. Tea bags, although sometimes might be only paper, they usually have plastic lining as well. So we definitely don't recommend putting them into your compost either, for the same reason you wouldn't put the vacuum lint in there. Um, so with these nitrogen and green materials as well, a good sort of rule of thumb is that they generally are quite moist. Like they have a lot of water content, these materials, as opposed to the brown materials, which are generally quite dry. And with both of these, they benefit from being pulverized or chopped, because the smaller you can get those materials, the faster they'll break down. It's really important though that when these other materials that you can see here, so meat or seafood, dairy products, fat or oil, plastics, and which includes tea bags and vacuum lint, as I just covered, weed heads and animal poo. It's really important that these materials don't go into your compost, apart from there are some notable exceptions, like I've just said. So animal poo, if you are pet poo composting, go ahead. But if you're using this compost for edible gardens, which many people do, wouldn't recommend. And again, weed heads, go ahead if you're hot composting. So just make sure these aren't hard and fast rules, but just make sure you're confident with the system you're using and the material you want to be disposing of first. So once you've got your ingredients, you'll want to start layering them. So firstly, you'll start with a thick layer, about 15 centimeters of twigs or coarse mulch at the base for drainage. So you can see here on the right in this diagram at the very bottom, that's providing the drainage for any excess moisture, which can go straight into the soil below. Um, Once you've done this, you'll want to add a thin layer of green materials, so your nitrogen-rich materials like fruit, veg, um, eggshells as well, anything like that. Then you'll cover that entirely with a layer of brown materials. And then after that, you want to add water until there's sufficient moisture. Depending on how much green material you've added, you might not need to add water to it because that brown material will absorb the excess moisture in the nitrogen materials, but often you will have to add a bit of water. Um, Basically, a good rule of thumb to how much moisture you want in your compost heap is when you pick it up, if you grab a handful of that compost or the mixed materials in there, it should, there shouldn't, and you squeeze it in your hand, sorry, no water should drip out of it. So it should be sort of like the texture of a wrung out or damp sponge. So not dripping wet, but also not so dry that it just falls apart in your hands. And so once you've done those first three steps, so A, B, and C, you'll just repeat those over and over. You don't need to keep adding the drainage layer. So it's just A, B, and C again and again. Keeps it nice and simple. And then once you've got a finished compost product, you can use some to make the first layer in your next heap. And especially the beneficial organisms and that biodiversity in there that we were talking about earlier, they help to give it a really good kickstart and it'll accelerate the process for your next heap. And number four, maintaining your compost. So a rule or a sort of set of principles that I like to follow are called the Adam principles. Um, Basically, so Adam is an acronym for these four words. So firstly, aliveness, diversity, aeration, and moisture. So aliveness being you want to see signs of life in your compost. A healthy compost heap is a living ecosystem of worms, microbes, bacteria, and fungi, which work together to break down organic materials. So both hot and cold composting have these have this microbiology within them, except hot composting will only have organisms that can survive that higher heat. So it pretty much rules out any of those bacteria and fungi and other microorganisms that simply can't survive high heat levels. Um, Typically, for hot composting, it can be in the range of 50 to 70 degrees. Um, so for most things, it's just not really a livable environment. So much to the same, like for worms, definitely way too hot for them. So you'll know one of the good signs of seeing if there's life in your compost heap is you'll see steam rising off it on cold days as well. And this is basically just a sign that these organisms are moving about and that they're respiring and generating heat, which is a good indicator that your compost is working well. Um, Also, diversity. So you'll want to add a variety of ingredients to your compost, and this will help to create a balanced, nutrient-rich product. So just making sure that you're getting the right ratio of materials in there in terms of the ones we were just talking about before. So your carbon-rich materials and your nitrogen-rich materials, and trying to get as much diversity of those ingredients in there as well, so that you're getting lots of different nutrients and minerals in the product. It'll also help to create a more structurally sound product as well that's more versatile. Aeration. So organisms living in compost need oxygen. So aerate at least once a week with a pitchfork or spiral tool. This will also help to deter pests and reduce smells. So especially for pests like cockroaches and rats, they'll get scared off by this. Um, if you're hot composting, this aerating the pile should be done quite frequently. I'd say more than once a week. But for other composting methods, once a week is a good rule of thumb. Um, Cold composting, you don't have to aerate that often. But again, there's no golden rule to it. It very much depends on your own compost system and its environment. But generally, cold composting, you don't want to disturb it as much because what you're looking for is that aliveness in there and the biodiversity within your heap. Um, Finally, moisture. So this is one that people often get stumped by, and it's often one of the biggest issues that people have is either that their compost heap is too wet or that it's too dry. So maintaining the right level of moisture, it comes with experience really and just getting to know your compost heap and how much water you should be adding and how often. Um, because the organisms in there need water. So how's what it says here is so a sufficiently moist compost should feel like a wrung out sponge. Add water every 1 to 2 weeks, especially during hot weather. If your compost is too wet, add some dry carbon materials. So these carbon materials will help to soak up that excess moisture. Um, but yeah, very important, this part of it, because if it's too dry, it can attract ants and it also just will hardly really decompose because you won't have much aliveness in there because these organisms need that water. If it's too wet, then it will start to rot the materials in there and it'll attract more pests and it can also suffocate or drown the organisms in there, especially worms. So, using compost in your garden, how can you actually apply the finished product? Um, so mainly what most people use compost for is soil conditioning. So you can mix the compost into your garden soil to improve its structure, nutrient content, and water holding capacity. And also mulching. So you can spread the compost around the base of established plants to lock in moisture, suppress weeds, and slowly release nutrients into the soil. Ideally, mix the compost with larger bark chips to improve its longevity. And it's also interesting to know that different plants benefit from compost in different ways. So, for example, vegetables and flowers thrive on the nutrient boost, while trees and shrubs appreciate the improved soil structure. So, as you're putting it on your garden, you'll get to know what areas might benefit the most or what sort of applications might be best for you. You can also see in this picture here, this is what finished compost will look like. So a very dark, earthy sort of material. And again, the moisture for this, if you pick it up in your hand, it should clump together and it shouldn't drip. So it should be like a wrung out sponge. We'll now go into some common compost issues and how to troubleshoot them. So one of the most common composting issues is unpleasant odors, and along with that, fruit flies or mites. So it might be any one of these, but basically the cause is usually the same, and that's that your compost isn't aerated properly and that too many food scraps have been added. Um, so for this, you want to add some dry carbon materials to absorb the excess moisture, as well as some garden lime to reduce the acidity. And then you'll turn the heap to aerate the materials in it. Um, and this should help to deter the fruit flies and mites, as well as get rid of those odors from rotting material. For rats and cockroaches, they aren't quite as common as fruit flies and mites, but they definitely can be there. Um, Usually the cause of this is that there's meat, dairy, or excessive bread added to the heap, as well as exposed scraps. Can also be if you're not aerating the heap often enough, they can home themselves in there. So you want to make sure that you're aerating. So again, hydrate and aerate the heap, cover it, and then place chicken wire or mesh beneath it. So this will help to prevent rats and other pests coming up from underneath the heap. Often as well, it can help to keep the compost off the ground and improve the drainage a little bit. If your compost is slow to mature, this is usually a result of unfavorable conditions. So this can be a mixture of what materials you're putting in there, how moist the compost is, the temperature, as well as how well aerated it is. Um, And the solution for this is ensuring you're following the Adam principles. So usually compost will take about 8 to 12 weeks to form, but it can take much longer. It can be faster depending on the system that you're using, but generally 8 to 12 weeks is a good indicator. You should at least be seeing signs that it's decomposing then. So if it is taking a while, just make sure you're going through the Adam principles and just checking off each one, making sure that you've got it all right. And from there, you should be able to identify what the issue is and work towards a fix. I also just wanted to touch on the importance of preventing fruit fly. So if you do see signs of fruit fly in your compost heap, it's incredibly important to stop the spread of Queensland fruit fly. And composting can be a make or break of this. So if you do see any signs of Queensland fruit fly, I'd highly recommend looking through the rest of your compost heap and trying to eradicate it fully. So just as a bit of background, if you don't already know what Queensland fruit fly is, it's a serious pest for both home gardeners and commercial growers, and it's found throughout Victoria. So it's not just localized to any one sort of area in Victoria. Always inspect your fruit and veg for signs of Queensland fruit fly, and if it's found, do not place it into your compost or worm farm. So on the right here, you can see larvae and the larvae in this picture on the right, possibly some eggs down the bottom, but little white sacs essentially. And on the far right is a diagram of a fruit fly, a Queensland fruit fly. They usually have as well, one of the best identifying features is they have really vibrant red eyes. And as you can see here, 7 millimeters, so they're very small. They can be smaller than that as well. But the red eyes are a good indicator of them. So before disposing of it in your general waste bin, treat produce affected by Queensland fruit fly and always double bag it. You can also boil, microwave, or freeze the produce affected by the Queensland fruit fly before disposing of it. Agriculture Victoria still, even if you've gone through any of these methods, so boiling, microwaving, or freezing, they still don't recommend putting it back into your garden on the off chance that there may still be Queensland fruit fly present in there. So it's best to just play it safe and still double bag it before disposing of it. If you're just putting it straight into double bags, then leave it in the sun for a little while to kill any of the fruit fly infestation in that produce or the materials, and then dispose of it. So for any more on this, you can go to the Agriculture Victoria website and search for Queensland fruit fly. And if you have any inquiries or reports or sightings of Queensland fruit fly, you can call the number 136 186 as shown there. And that's for Agriculture Victoria as well. And I'm just going to show this quick video as well for how you can prevent fruit fly in your garden.
Queensland fruit fly can be a problem for home gardeners and commercial growers because it attacks a large variety of fruit and vegetables, making them inedible. Queensland fruit fly spreads from infested plants to nearby fruit and vegetables, and by people sharing or travelling with homegrown fruit or vegetables. While fruit and vegetables may look fine from the outside, they may be rotten or have eggs or maggots hidden inside. So what do Queensland fruit flies look like? Adult flies are approximately 7 millimeters long and a reddish-brown in colour with distinct yellow markings. Queensland fruit fly goes through 4 main stages of life. The adult female Queensland fruit fly injects her eggs into host fruit, laying up to 100 eggs a day. Eggs are white and 1 millimetre long, which makes them hard to see. You may see tiny puncture marks in fruit. The eggs hatch into creamy yellow maggots that grow up to 9 millimetres long. The maggots feed on the fruit, eventually chewing their way out. The maggots then burrow into the ground and change into oval, brown, hard pupae. After a few weeks, if conditions are suitable, the fruit flies come out of the ground and look for food around gardens. After feeding and mating, females search for suitable ripe fruit to lay their eggs into, and their cycle continues. So if you want to grow fruit and vegetables in your garden, check for Queensland fruit fly and take steps to manage it before it spoils your produce or spreads to other properties. So, to protect your garden, hang traps to monitor and catch Queensland fruit flies. Apply baits and cover sprays to control Queensland fruit flies. Pick up and dispose of fallen fruit. Remove unwanted fruiting trees and vegetables. And net host fruit and vegetable plants. For more information on Queensland fruit fly, visit www.agriculture.vic.gov.au/QFF.
Alrighty. Hopefully you're already well versed in Queensland fruit fly, but if you're not, hopefully that gave you a good background and maybe a good refresher on why it's so important to prevent. All right. So we will now get stuck into worm farming. Um, so this worm farming isn't actually different so much to composting. It is a type of composting system actually. So still decomposing materials into a garden ready product. Except this method uses worms to metabolize your food leftovers into rich soil-like castings, and this is worm poo. So they're also called, this product is also called vermicompost. So the castings are great for feeding houseplants, adding to seedling mixes and potting soils, or top dressing around established plants. So it's a very versatile product. They're also very compact and suit homes of all sizes, including units, and they can be kept inside or outside. The liquid produced by your worm farm leachate is full of nutrients. You can dilute it and use it on plants. So leachate and castings, which we'll get into a bit more in a little while, they're the main two products that you'll get from worm farming, and they're both incredibly beneficial for your garden in their own respects. So again, I've kind of just condensed these really key steps for worm farming. Very similar to with composting, just to keep it easy. So first off, again, you want to choose the right site. Secondly, collect your worm food, making sure that you're getting the right mix, so the right ratios and the actual right ingredients in there. Then you'll want to build your worm farm, and after that, you'll harvest the products that we've just talked about. So firstly, choosing the right site. So an ideal site for a worm farm is well shaded, so the worms don't get too hot. A covered area like a garage, carport, or veranda works great. It's really important to remember that with worms being living organisms and larger than other microorganisms and different types of fungi and whatnot, their sort of bodily composition or the sort of climates they like to live in and the environments they like to live in are more similar to humans. So it's a bit better of a rule of thumb to think. If you wouldn't be comfortable living in that sort of climate that they're in, then they're probably too hot or too cold. So it is important to remember to keep them comfortable so that they can reproduce and feed as well. Because if they're too hot or too cold, they'll either die or they just will not move. Um, Also, you want to make sure that, again, the site is easily accessible so that you are upkeeping it. Don't place it too far away a walk so that you, if it's raining, too hot, too cold, that you're going to make excuses. So put it somewhere that you know it's going to be convenient to put your scraps into. And also close to a water source. So again, we want to make sure that the worm farm is a good moisture level because the worms will need to be sufficiently hydrated as well as the product itself in there. Then you want to collect your worm food. Um, so it's quite similar to compost materials with a few exceptions. So mainly worms like to eat vegetable and fruit peelings, juice pulp. So what's left after you, if you have a juicer, you can put that in there. Crushed eggshells, bread, small amounts of soiled paper and cardboard. But worms don't like to eat tea bags. So again, the plastic line. So if you've got loose leaf tea, feel free to put it in there, but tea bags themselves, they will not eat. Um, Dairy products, so butter and cheese, they won't touch it. They don't like to eat it, and it will also attract rats and possibly other type of vermin and cockroaches. So definitely wouldn't recommend putting dairy products, meat and bones in there for that reason. Um, and also acidic foods, so like garlic, onions, chili and citrus. Much too acidic for the worm's digestive tract, so they again will not go near that. Um, Another good tip is to consider blending your scraps with water before feeding your worms. They'll digest this easier and faster. So make a little smoothie for them, or if you've got a juicer, you can put some of your scraps in there and make a juice for the worms. Yeah. All right. Third step, you will want to build your worm farm. So store-bought worm farms typically have 3 to 4 working trays with a collection tray beneath. So working trays you can see on the diagram, in the diagram on the right, they're the top 3 trays. So each of these have holes in their bases to allow the worms to travel, let air in, and ensure good drainage, which you can see at the bottom, all of the leachate dripping down to the collection tray. So the collection tray catches this excess liquid or leachate that can then be drained through the tap, which you see on the right. So basically, how it works is you want to make sure that the worms can move freely through these working trays, and you'll alternate them as you put your scraps through. So you'll remove any of the castings, put them on your garden, and then continue to add scraps to that. You can also make your own worm farms through DIY options. I'd highly recommend doing this. It's a really great way to get creative. So you can, a lot of these are probably the most common methods in terms of the DIY options. So repurposed bathtubs or kitchen or laundry sinks. Um, the ceramic of them is a really good kind of like insulating material. Um, and also the large volume just means you can put a lot more into there and a lot more worms. So really good as well because they have a tap at the bottom. So there's already good drainage there. So all of that leachate will just go to the bottom and then out the tap. You can also use buckets and boxes as seen in this middle picture. Really easy to sort of retrofit into a worm farm because they'll literally just stack on top of each other. And then you can just drill a hole for drainage in the bottom collection tray. You can even see someone's repurposed this wheelie bin. So essentially that would just be layered inside, like kind of mimicking those working trays. And then they would most likely have a bit of drainage at the bottom there. So maybe some twigs or something to just keep whatever they're using as working trays just up off the ground so that that leachate can freely drain through. And on the right here, you can see, similarly to the boxes, they've used buckets stacked on top of each other. So really just, yeah, get creative with what you've got on hand, because more often than not, you can really make something work. Also, just to touch on that as well, sorry, worm worm beds and worm towers. So you can actually just build a worm bed straight into your garden. So if you just effectively just dig a hole and then mimic those sorts of layers, then it achieves the same effect, and the worms can also move freely in and out of the garden. And so that as they do that, they're aerating the soil and conditioning the soil, as well as distributing that, well, the castings, which will provide nutrients to your plants, they're distributing them across the soil so you don't have to do that manually. So worm towers are my most preferred method personally. I like the ease of them and the sort of versatility and the customization, and the fact that yeah, the worms can freely come and go. So especially on hot or cold days, so they can just burrow further down and find somewhere more comfortable. So you don't have to be as worried about leaving them to be than if you had working trays or like a store-bought worm farm. So to make your own worm farm, it works in layers, again, similar to compost. So you firstly want to make a 10 to 15 centimeter deep bedding layer from a combination of finished compost, leaves, and soggy paper. This is just a recommended combination. You can also get creative with that and use what you've got on hand. So it's not hard and fast rule, just if you do have those products, it is a really good start for the worms. The bedding should be torn or shredded enough for the worms to move freely. So again, you want them to be able to move through those working trays, to be able to access the fresh materials up the top, but also move down in case they want to burrow down and reproduce or rest or whatever, then they will go down. After that, you want to add between 1,000 and 2,000 worms. Again, general rule, if you have a smaller worm farm, you might only want to add 500, but generally 1,000 to 2,000 is a really good start if you want your materials to break down relatively quickly. Gently spread them across the surface and then allow them to burrow down. So be careful when you're taking them out of whatever bucket or bag you've got them in, and just allow them to make themselves comfortable. And then after this, you'll want to regularly add kitchen scraps to the surface, only in small amounts, and always cover it with bedding. So you want to cover these scraps because it'll absorb the excess moisture, but almost more importantly, it'll ensure a really dark environment for the worms so that they will be encouraged to actually come up to the surface and eat those scraps that you've put there for them. It'll also deter any other pests from getting into there and competing for those scraps. You'll also only want to add food when most of the worm's previous meal has been eaten. So mainly because you don't want it to rot and you don't want to deter the worms from going up there to eat. So if there is any excess after about a day after, just remove that from the worm farm. And you can either compost that or put it into your FOGO bin. So some good bedding options are newspaper, cardboard, dry, crunchy leaves, egg cartons, natural fiber textiles like old cotton shirts, and soil or compost. And for cover options, so that going above your food scraps, you can use any of the above bedding options for that. Hessian bags are really great. And you can ask your local cafe or coffee roaster if they have any spares of those, because they usually get coffee beans in those Hessian bags. And also worm blankets. So they're you can buy them at hardware stores, garden stores, and they're a purpose-made blanket that goes on top. They're usually made of coconut, like coir sort of material, like a fiber. But yeah, there's plenty of DIY options. So once you've built your worm farm, it's just really a matter of waiting and maintaining it in the meantime. But after a little while, you'll have your castings and leachate. So you're more likely to get your leachate first because of just excess moisture draining through the worm farm. Um, and this pretty much this excess water, as it passes through the worm farm, it pulls nutrients and castings with it. So on that, you don't want to flush it too much because you don't want to drown the worms, and you also don't want to flush out all of those nutrients. So don't do this. Don't keep your worm farm at a good moisture level is the good sort of rule of thumb, because then you'll get a really good quality leachate that isn't really dilute and probably not going to be very effective. So when you do have the leachate, you will want to dilute it then, because it's an ultra concentrated sort of product, and it will likely burn your plants if you put it directly on them, because of just the excess amount of nutrients and minerals in there. Um, so a good rule of thumb for that is 1 part of the leachate to 10 parts of water. And then you can put this into your watering can or whatever else you might use to water your garden, and then water around the plants you want to fertilize every 1 to 2 weeks during the growing season. And it's best used fresh. Castings, so they're worm poo. You can use these as top dressing and slow release fertilizer, and you can apply a thin layer of castings around the base of established plants. Also important to note with leachate, it's a common sort of misconception that it's worm urine or wee, but it's actually more like worm sweat, because they expel this moisture through their pores in a very similar way that humans would. So just worth making that sort of distinction, and that leachate isn't solely this worm sweat. It's mainly the sort of nutrients that are getting washed through the castings. And also, worm tea as well is not leachate. They're two different things. So, worm tea is generally a brewed product from castings, and also like a molasses, and it's pretty much heated up to make this brew that is supposed to have other beneficial qualities. But we won't get into that tonight, but just worth making that distinction. So, troubleshooting worm farm issues. So much the same as composting, unpleasant odors are a pretty common issue with worm farms. And usually this is because of overfeeding. So the materials that you're putting there haven't been eaten, and then the the materials start to rot. So all you really want to do is reduce feeding and cover scraps with dry bedding to absorb that excess moisture. And just making sure that you're removing the scraps a day after feeding the worms. Um, any other undesired visitors? So fruit flies and mites, again, probably caused by overfeeding, and the same fix. So just reducing the feeding and covering the scraps with some dry bedding. The bedding will not only absorb the excess moisture, but cover the material so it's harder for them to actually get in. Ants usually are attracted because it's a very dry environment. They don't like wet, moist environments. So they will go for the food if the materials are too dry. So all you want to do is add some water to that. So spray over the materials. If they're not producing, this can be for a number of reasons, but usually it's that the environment or climate around them is in the extreme. So it could be too cold or too warm. Um, it could also be too wet or too dry in there, and the pH might be off. So with this, you want to try and maintain a livable environment. So between 13 and 25 degrees, moisture like a damp sponge, so similar to compost. You want to make sure there's good drainage and adjust the pH. There's a few different ways you can adjust the pH depending on which way it's swinging. So you can add garden lime or wood ash if it's too acidic. And one of the main reasons it might be too acidic as well is if you're adding too much citrus or chili or garlic, things like that. Yeah, the worms will not eat it, and then the pH will pretty much swing out of balance. Also with temperature, you can try moving the worm farm into a warmer or cooler spot, depending on what kind of system you have and the size of it and the portability. You can also try putting an insulating layer around it. So, like car windshield sort of solar blankets work quite well for that. You can also, on really hot days, you can wrap a cool towel around it, or put a fan on that as well. Yeah, really, you can do anything that you would do yourself to keep yourself cool or warm. So just get creative with that. Um, and again, if worms are escaping or dying, it's usually for the same reason. Um, yeah, so if it's too hot or too cold, they generally the signs of this is that they will just not be moving very much at all because they'll be sort of hibernating at that point. Um, so a good sort of guide is to ensure that your worm farm is moist, well drained, covered, and not acidic. And again, just making sure that you're removing those scraps a day after. So some key things to consider when you're deciding on a system, whether it's a composting system or worm farming or any other types of decomposition systems, so like the Bokashi bins and the electric composters. You'll want to consider the amount of space you have available. So simple hot and cold compost piles, they generally require a really large amount of space, whereas tumblers, pet poo composters, and worm farms are quite compact and suitable for people with smaller properties. The type of waste generated as well. So, for example, worm farms are excellent for most kitchen waste, but not meat, citrus, and onions. Time and effort required. So they all require different degrees of maintenance. If you're unlikely to regularly turn a compost heap, a tumbler might be your best option. And also the desired end product. So this includes the type of product as well as the volume of it. So if you're just after a soil conditioner or mulch, for instance, a simple compost system may be a good fit. Um, but if you're really Also, if you're trying to improve the biodiversity in your soil, you might want to consider cold composting rather than hot. But if you're trying to make a compost out of weeds, then hot composting would be much better because there's a higher chance that you'll be able to heat treat those weeds. And finally, for any other resources and further learning, you can visit the Yarra Ranges Council website. And on here as well, you can apply for our home composting rebate. And this gives you $40 back on a one-off purchase of eligible items to start your own composting at home. So not only does this include the different compost systems just mentioned, so like different compost bins, including tumblers, and bokashi bins and worm pet poo composters, so the worm tower sort of things. It also includes worm farms, composting worms. So usually these are red wrigglers and tiger worms. And yeah, bokashi bins, just as mentioned, as well as accessories like the spirals for aeration, and blankets and whatnot. You can also, so for any other items that you need to dispose of, and you're wondering whether it's recyclable or whether it should go in through hazardous waste, whether it can't go in your curbside, you can always find out how to dispose of an item with our A to Z guide. If it's not on there or you want maybe more up-to-date information or just want to double check, you can also always reach out to us directly through email or by calling us. Um, you can also, when you're on the Yarra Ranges Council website, stay up to date on events and workshops like this as they're announced, and you'll be able to access the recording of this webinar for future reference. So, especially as you're getting started with your worm farm or composting system, you might want to have a look back at the atom principles or all the different steps to get started, or maybe you're having some issues already. If that's the case, you can always go back and have a look at this. And that leads us into questions. How does a hot compost pile get hot? Can this work on a south-facing slope that doesn't get much sun? Uh, it could, yes. So they get hot because of the microorganisms in there and the activity, and they generally the increased aeration. So as opposed to cold composting where it doesn't get aerated as much, there's lots of oxygen in there. So you could put it on a south-facing slope that doesn't get much sun, but it's still, yeah, it would benefit from maybe a warmer spot. The other thing is if it's in a spot with full sun, you need to make sure that it's moist enough as well. So you'll probably have to water the heat a lot more. Um,
I'll also add to that one that it's going to be also more effective in the summer. In reality, for Yarra Ranges, we're probably not going to get the temperatures that you need, even in a hot location, a full sun location for over winter. So summertime, you could definitely give it a crack though when we've got those really warm days.
Cool. Thanks, Lisa. Um, my tumbler compost has strong odors. What is my problem? So could be from a number of things, but probably because you've got too many green or nitrogen-rich materials in there. So you want to absorb that excess moisture by putting in some more brown or carbon-rich materials. So cardboard, dry leaves, some old potting mix if you've got it, anything like that that can absorb that excess moisture because it'll probably be rotting in there at the moment. I'm assuming that you need to move the pet poo composting after it's full. Can you plant edible things where it has been after? No, I because you don't want it to get so full that you have to move it. It should be breaking down fast enough that it all gets released into the soil beneath through the worms decomposing it or metabolizing it. So if that's happening, then you should maybe consider adding like an accelerant to the bin or moving it somewhere else that it might be a bit more viable. Just really trying to pinpoint why it's not breaking down the waste as quickly. There might also be just too much of the volume going in there for the worms to actually decompose. I'd like to understand a bit more about why the anaerobic are not garden ready. Um, Basically because they lack any of the sort of complexity or the sort of structure that a finished compost product has. So with Bokashi, basically it's a fermented product. So it will kill potential pathogens that can be harmful through like meat, dairy, and whatnot, because they usually thrive in oxygen-rich environments like aerobic microorganisms, and but also with electric compost, it hasn't had the time to develop that sort of structure and complexity and the biodiversity in it. So ideally, you want to add that into your compost heap. And then,
Essentially, the items are like a pickling of your food waste that you've put in there. So they're really high in nitrogen and they're likely to burn your plants. So they need to do further composting within, say, a pit in your garden that you've dug, or being added to maybe a friend's compost heap. If you have a friend, if your garden's quite small and you've got a friend who can add that material and it acts as an accelerator for another compost bin, but it's not fully composted to use straight in your garden. But you can use the liquid from the Bokashi bins in the same way as you would the worm farm liquid that comes out of the worm farm.
yeah, and on that, just diluting it before it goes on, because like
Yes.
Lisa said, that it's a very nutrient-rich product at the end of it. So yeah, just making sure you spread the love a bit in the garden with that. Uh, if there is fungi in my worm farm or tumbler, is that a bad thing? Um, Depends on the species, really, but generally, fungi is a really good sign that you have a very healthy compost. So definitely not a bad thing. It's actually a very good indicator. You want a lot of diversity in your compost heap. So usually fungi thrive in really nutrient-rich environments. So yeah, that's a good indicator that there's enough moisture, oxygen, you're getting like the right mix of things needed in there. Does aeration need to not mix the layers?
When you've got the compost bin layers.
All right. Generally you'll layer things up first, then wait a period, and then mix it. Tumblers, they don't need layering. You'd put the same ratios into there, but you don't need to layer it. When it's just when you're using piles and whatnot. So it basically the layers help it to get started, and then you aerate it after that once it's had a bit of time to sit.
I would probably, with mine, wait maybe, depending on the size, I might wait like a month or so, and then start mixing it. And every time that I put in a little bit of green stuff, I add in some brown stuff and then give it a mix. Maybe once a week on the weekend or something.
Hmm. Yeah, and that's the thing. You'll, over time, depending on your own backyard or your own sort of microclimate, you and your own needs, it'll really vary from person to person. So just keep an eye on it and yeah, pay close attention at the start, especially, and you'll get a really good um, sort of green thumb for it. Can I empty the ash and charred wood into my compost bins while cleaning up my wood fire heater? Yeah, you definitely can, but just be careful that it may bring the pH to a very base level. If it's already quite acidic, then definitely go ahead, but I wouldn't put too much in there just in case it really sways the pH. So yeah, depending on how big your heap is, like if you're pile composting, like hot or cold composting, then you might, yeah, you could do that. But just something to keep in mind is the pH. Can you talk more to tumblers? Obviously, layers can't work, but are the same proportions important? Yes, exactly. So as you're adding things, you'll pretty much just want to make sure that you're adding at around the same time, adding that 60 to 70% brown materials and 30 to 40% green materials. So you're definitely wanting those brown materials in there to soak up the excess moisture. Um, but essentially, it's the same as layering in the way that you treat it after, so aerating it, semi-regularly. Wouldn't
We've got
winters
3 more minutes to go through the last few questions, so just a reminder on the time.
Oh, yes. You might be best placed to answer this one, Lisa. So, wouldn't winters in the hills be too cold for worms, based on the idea that they like similar temperatures to humans?
Uh, You can move the worms into a warmer position. They definitely can survive. I've lived in the hills. I know plenty of people who do live in the hills and have worm farms. So it's really about choosing a position where they might get a little bit of morning sun to warm them up a little bit. Or you can wrap them in blankets. You can buy at the hardware store and nursery, you can buy blankets, or you can use Hessian or similar on the top, like under the lid to keep some of the warmth in. But it's really just about finding the right location. But it's definitely possible in the hills because there are plenty of people who do it.
All right,
And technically, you could even cover it with like carpet or something that might keep it a bit warmer as well, keep that cold, like frosty mornings that we're getting at the moment and stuff like that away as well.
yeah. And even if you move them into a garage or carport, even somewhere where they might not be as frostbitten, then that always
Yeah.
helps. I'll smash through the last few, sorry, just because we're running a bit short on time, but wouldn't the ground coffee waste be too acidic for composting? Yes, coffee grounds are very acidic and nitrogen rich, so use them, they wouldn't be too acidic necessarily. It just depends how much you're putting on there. So use sparingly, I would say. I have slugs on top of the worm farm blankets. Could it be a bit damp and maybe too much food? Yes, it's a good bit of troubleshooting there. That's where my guess would go. Um, so yeah, just remove that excess food and maybe just wait for a little while before you add more just so it can dry out a bit. Can you put moldy food in the compost? I believe so.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Not in your worm farm, but definitely in your compost bin and mix it in with some dry materials and see how it goes. I've put moldy things in mine before and it's been fine.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, obviously, if you've got a huge amount of moldy food, it's not perfect. But if it's just a kid's sandwich that's been left in the bottom of their bag for a bit too long or something like that, then a little bit is fine. You just mix it up with some dry stuff and yeah, the bugs in there will break it down.
Yeah, but that's the fun thing about composting and worm farming is that it can be a bit of a science experiment and a lot of trial and error. So yeah, balance is one of really the key thing in all of this. If cardboard has been treated to harden them with forever chemicals, is this detrimental in using this in compost on our veggie patch? Yes, I yeah, definitely wouldn't recommend putting treated timber or any other treated materials into your compost. Yeah, because of the risk of the chemicals that are in there. I definitely wouldn't put it on the veggie patch. You might be able to put it in other parts of your garden, but just in future, yeah, just steer clear of putting any treated products into there. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming along this evening. I hope you learned something new and that you feel confident in getting started on your own composting journey or worm farming.